Good morning.
Good morning.
Okay, today is March 21st.
I think it is. First day of spring.
First day of spring. Okay, thank you. And this is Mr. Ron Gaus, who's going to speak to us regarding Pilgrim Congregational Church on Union Boulevard. Thank you.
So this is the sort of the history of this somewhat unusual church and historic church near Delmore and Union Boulevard today. But in 1853, there was a Sunday school near Washington and 29th Street that was run by a gentleman named Edgell, Edgell. And he ran that Sunday school from 1853 until around 1866. And it was very successful. And in the as it reached 1866, 65, 66, over 200 kids were coming to his Sunday school every Sunday morning. And among these children, in the latter years especially, there were a group of young black children that were also invited to be a part of this Sunday school. And at that time, that was not universally acceptable. But Mr. Edgell, Stephen Edgell, felt that it was something that needed to be done. So he allowed it, and he taught those kids as well. However, the landlord of the building that Mr. Edgell was renting for his Sunday school found out about that. And because Mr. Edgell was allowing them in, the landlord canceled his lease in 1866, and Mr. Edgell would have been out of business. But Mr. Edgell was a member of First Congregational Church at that time as well in the city. Mr. Edgell talked to a number of people, 14 exactly, about possibly starting a church in that neighborhood where there was already 200 kids coming for Sunday school. And the people that split off from that First Congregational Church to form a new church at that Sunday school location in 1866, they didn't know what name to call it, but it was in December when they were wanting to start this church. So they looked at the history of the country at that point and learned that in December, on December 22nd, the Pilgrims had actually landed on Plymouth Rock. And therefore they decided that they would, even though they would incorporate on December 5th, 1866, they would have their first service on the weekend of December 22nd, which was for the Pilgrims. And they would call themselves Pilgrim Congregational Church at that time. So they started the church with actually 40 members came over from First Congregational, and they built their numbers up under Reverend Monteith, Monteith, who was from Elyria, Ohio. And in the first few years, Reverend Monteith took the population of Pilgrim from 40 members all the way up to about 200 members. And on the 1st of January in 1869, 2 years after the formation of the church, there was a gathering at one of the Board of Trustees' houses, and Reverend Monteith was there at that time. There is no written record of this, but what I'm going to tell you next is our best guess based upon who Reverend Monteith was and who the leaders of the church were at that time. We believe there was an argument that broke out at that gathering. It was a holiday gathering on January 1st. And during that gathering, there was an argument that took place on the future of Pilgrim now that they had 200 members. How would they grow the church from here? And there was one gentleman in the room that says, the only way we can grow our church is to allow everyone that wants to join to join. We can have no restrictions on who joins our church. Rich, poor, anyone that wants to join our church can join our church. And another gentleman in the room, a man named Judge Courier, who would also be within a year a member of the Missouri Supreme Court, Judge Courier said, that is not who Pilgrim will be. Pilgrim will be an elite class of citizens in St. Louis. We will only have other people who are of the highest income levels. The most important people in St. Louis will be allowed to join our church. And in limiting our membership to only those, we will have more money to give to benevolence through the years. We will be known as one of the top givingest churches in the country because we will have the people within our church that can afford to do that. Well, the first man started calling Mr. Courier a number of different names, saying he wasn't following the Bible. And Judge Courier called the other gentleman even worse names, saying he did not care about the downtrodden. If he did, he would not argue. And the two of them had a vehement argument that ended up resulting in the party being called off for the rest of the day. The following Sunday, after he gave his sermon, Reverend Monteith stood in front of the congregation and said, I was at a gathering of the Board of Trustees this past week, and I will not tell you what the discussion was about. But I will say that because of that discussion, I am going to resign my duties as your pastor and start another church immediately. And if that wouldn't have been shock enough, Reverend Monteith continued, and I would like to invite anyone that would like to come with me to step on the left side of the church as he stepped to the left side of the church. 71 people joined him. That 71 people represented 40% of the current membership of the church. The other half that remained said, let us talk about this for a few minutes, Reverend Monteith. And they did. And they said, Reverend Monteith, we would like to give you $1,700 to start a new church from our church to your church as a gift. And in addition to that, all of the people that are going to join with you, the 71 other members that are joining with you, they owe money. They made pledges to our church based upon their pew rentals for the following year. And because of that, what we're going to do is we're going to say to you, you don't owe that money anymore. We're waiving your debts to our church. We want you to be able to focus on providing money to Reverend Monteith for his church. And that was it. And for the next year or so, our church, Pilgrim, struggled to find a good minister to replace Reverend Monteith. 2 years later, they did find that gentleman. His name was Goodell, Constance Goodell, Goodell. And Mr. Goodell raised our membership from about the 100 that it was when Monteith left to over 1,200 by the time he left. So Reverend Goodell made a huge impact on our church. And oh, by the way, what happened to Reverend Monteith? Well, after about a year, his church was not doing real well, and he also fell ill. But a year after that, he felt much better and had regained his abilities to preach. But rather than preach, he took a job that was orchestrated by Judge Courier, who is now on the Supreme Court of the state of Missouri. Judge Courier arranged to have Reverend Monteith hired as the superintendent of schools for the state of Missouri. And in that role, and Judge Currier knew this, Reverend Monteith would be able to make a difference in the lives of Black children across the state of Missouri. At the time that he took over, there were 59 churches that were grade schools for Black children in the state of Missouri, 59. By the time Reverend Monteith had finished his time at the state of Missouri in 1875, 5 years later, he had increased the 59 to 281 churches. More important than that, at the time he took over the role that he took as superintendent of schools, only 6% of the eligible children, Black children in the state of Missouri, were being educated at a grade school. By the time he left with the 281 schools, 33% of the children in the state were now attending the grade schools that had now been built. So he took the numbers of students from 6% to 33% as well. After that, he left the state of Missouri. He became a writer of nature books. He lived in the Ozarks for a few years and did other things for the rest of his life. But he was always known as a very important person in the civil rights area. Back to Pilgrim. After Reverend Goodell built the church up to 1,400 or 1,300 members over his time here, Pilgrim did what Judge Currier thought they would do. They gave more money in benevolence than any other church in Missouri. In fact, they gave more money to benevolence than all of the other churches combined. 40% of the I shouldn't say all of the other churches combined, they gave 40% of the total of all of the churches in the state of Missouri. So they gave 40%, all the other churches in the state gave 60%. So it was a huge portion of that. And in fact, over their next 40 years, Pilgrim had donated more money in all the congregational churches in the country, more money than all but four. They were the fifth givingest church in the entire country at a time when most of the congregational churches were in the Northeast. So that was quite an accomplishment. In 1900, Pilgrim looked at the neighborhood they were in, which had been a very elite neighborhood, and the city was changing geographically, and there were more poorer people that were moving into their area than had been there in the beginning. And because the neighborhood was changing, Pilgrim decided to move to the new horizon out west, which was near the corner of Delmar Boulevard and Delmar Avenue and Union Boulevard. They built there in 1906. The Christian Church had built there a few years earlier, and Westminster Presbyterian Church was built soon after Pilgrim was built. So this was the new hotspot in the area as far as churches went. When they built this church in 1906, they began to continue to build their numbers, and they also continued to focus only on the richer people in St. Louis so they could continue their benevolence pattern that had been built since that time. Fast forward now to 1950s. In the 1950s, now the new area had begun to change. The neighborhood was changing once again. And a number of people at Pilgrim said it's time for us to move even further west instead of staying here in this changing neighborhood. But by this time, enough other people in the church said, enough is enough. We are meant to make a difference to the people in this neighborhood. If this neighborhood is changing, we're already here to be able to help them. We're staying. And a vote was taken, and the vote was 60% to 40% to stay. So they stayed. But along with that vote in 1953, was a motion that would have had to have been voted upon on that same 60-40 ballot, that they were going to accept anyone who wanted to enjoy the walls of Pilgrim Church. We became the first church in the entire area to open our doors to people of the Black culture. And this is what we wanted to do, and that's what we did. It wasn't until 3 years later that we finally got our first Black member. And that Black member was a woman, a wonderful woman, who is still with us and living today. And her name is, and that woman's name was Velma Hunt, and Velma is still alive today. She's 96 years old, I believe, and until she was 92, I think, she was still working at Children's Hospital, where she had worked most of the years of her life in the admitting room, calming down children as they first came into the admitting room at Children's Hospital. So in 1953, a good portion of the church quit because they wanted to go to the west, further west. So we lost a lot of the income at that time from the church, but that was okay because we had now become the church that we were meant to be. And some further history on Reverend Monteith. The reason that we strongly believe that that's why he left the church is that his father was an abolitionist, a very famous abolitionist in Ohio. He also was one of the founding fathers of the University of Michigan, which was, I believe, the first public university in the country. So he was an abolitionist. He was also, his dad was an abolitionist, and he was also an important part of the Underground Railroad in that area near Cleveland. So if he was brought up in that household, then he would have been of the intent to have his doors open to everyone rather than just the richest people. And we think that's why he left, because of that. And in fact, the Post-Dispatch talked about his new church, which met at the Olympic Theater on Sunday evenings. And when they described his church, he said that the new church has rich people sitting next to poor people. It has people in t-shirts sitting next to people in suits, and it has people who are the presidents of corporations in the city sitting next to a maid. And that is the type of church that he is interested in building. So it's sort of obvious that that wasn't the church that Pilgrim was going to be, and that's why he stepped aside. So that's essentially who Pilgrim is, and some of the interesting things that have happened over the years is that I mentioned before Reverend Goodell being so good to our church and raising the numbers, but his wife happened to be the daughter of the governor of Vermont. But more important than that, the governor of Vermont was also with his brother, and his brother, the governor's name was Erasmus Fairbanks. And Erasmus and his brother were the ones that invented the platform scale, which meant they were very, very wealthy people before he even became governor. And because they were so wealthy, Emily had enough money to buy the clock for our church in 1867 when the building was first built. And that clock in today's dollars would have cost over $90,000. So she had enough money to buy a clock in today's dollars that would have cost the equivalent of $90,000. The other interesting thing is that the bells that were purchased for our tower in our original building and then moved to our building now, it's the same bells, same clock. Those bells were built in 1876. There were 10 bells, and the company that built or that manufactured those bells, the job right before our 10 bells was none other than the Centennial Bell that now hangs in Philadelphia to replace the Liberty Bell. So our bell followed the Centennial Bell at the Troy Foundry in Troy, New York. And that's another very interesting part of our history.
Yes. I really appreciate you taking time to share the history of Pilgrim Congregational Church. This is a second time because our first recording was lost. And I thank you for resharing this history. And I will share this history with our Mill Creek Valley Commemoration Committee and alder people or others who just want to know more about Pilgrim Congregational Church, because for me, I grew up in St. Louis City, and for some reason, I always believed Pilgrim Congregational Church was an all-white church. And you have you've shared the history, and I'm so glad to know that I was mistaken.
Yeah.
And it also leads me to think about other places in St. Louis that I have, I guess, not based on fact, just assumed information. So history is so important.
It is.
And recording the history for me is very important. So I'm not going to take any more of your time. I want to thank you again. And there are some other things that we've talked about, like the oldest member in your church. You know, I would love to have a conversation with her. And again, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate you coming in this morning, Barbara.
And I would like to say to all who are listening, I have my 2 grandchildren sitting at this table. You did not hear a word from them. I'd like for both of you to say hello.
Hello. Hi, my name is Ritaka.
Thank you 2 for sitting so quietly.
Yeah.
I'm doing multiplication and I'm on my last page.
Good for you.
Okay, thank you.